Sir, good afternoon. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
And Lord Darling, can you see and hear me?
I can see you both, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. We had looked at the period of July 1998. Can we move on to August 1998, please? And look at WITN 04200101.
Just before you do that,
Yes,
it occurred to me over the luncheon break, you referred to the ranking of ICL and the tender process, with the previous government. I would have added that even had I known that, if you have a legally binding contract, it doesn't help you that it was perhaps ill-advisedly signed by a previous government. As you know, the British governments have historically taken the view that if one government enters into a contract, it will be honoured by the next government. And it may be, I don't know of what consequence this is, but I'm just making that observation. What you've told me, I note, but it doesn't alter at all my evidence that I gave to the inquiry in relation to why I reached the view that I did.
I understand that, Lord Darling. The purpose of asking the question was whether the information would have been helpful in ascertaining whether what you were being told was, as to the technical viability of the project, was an isolated and recent problem, or was something that had been heralded for a number of years in the build-up to the preparation of the Montague report.
Yeah, I see that, although it has still been, the fact is we had a contract. And obviously what happened during our time was it became clear that ICL was, in our view, in breach. The fact that they had been ranked unfavourably, as you said, wouldn't actually have helped us in that regard.
Can we look at the minute of the 17th of August 1998 to you from Sarah Graham?
I see it, yes.
And this is one of the minutes that we have been provided with, although I don't think it's one that's been marked up by you. Can we look down, please, to the issues, and then scroll down, please, to recommendations. Discuss this with Stephen Byers before the 19th. This was the 17th. He's on holiday after that. His office don't know for how long. And then summary, if we can read that, please. There have been a number of developments over the past 2 weeks, including the emerging findings of the Post Office review, all of which appear to support your preferred outcome to cancel the project, or at least the BPC elements of it, on grounds of ICL Pathways' failure to deliver. And so was it your pre-existing preferential outcome to cancel the project, or at least the benefit payment card elements of it?
Well, as I've told you, it was a view that I formed and pretty much formed in a permanent way when both in the lead up to, but certainly on becoming Secretary of State. This is dated August
17th of August.
17th of August 1998. But I would have thought, by this time I would have had meetings with, the team and Sarah in particular, and they would be well aware of my view. And I suspect that's what led to the drafting of this note as it was.
You see that it mentions in the last part of that sentence, on grounds of ICL Pathways' failure to deliver. Is that a reflection that that was being used as a vehicle or a fig leaf to cover the real reason for getting out of the contract, namely an in-principle objection to it?
No, I don't think it was at all. I mean, look, had this whole project been going well, and they were delivering, then my views would have been, interesting, but they wouldn't have been compelling in terms of us terminating the contract. I say that the 3 points that I made, both my in principle and actually the practical elements of it, go together, and that that yes, I thought it was the wrong thing to do, but at the same time, I was receiving advice which was that the whole thing was going wrong and it wasn't going to deliver. So I put the two things together. You know, that they run together.
And so, although earlier today we looked at your three reasons and the problems with the project reason was the third of the three reasons, that was equally substantial a reason as the other two. Is that right?
Yeah. The 3 points that I made in my statement are, you know, they rank together, if you like. Now, obviously, you know, if the whole thing had been working, you know, and it was, you know, that there was no technical problems with it, then you know you have a contract, you are stuck with that contract. But as it happened, one of the reasons that when you know I came to form a view, and you know you form a view in the light of what's going on at the moment, you know all the facts in front of you. My view was that firstly it was a wrong thing to be doing anyway for the reasons I stated, but also they clearly weren't delivering on it, and that's why I devoted you know a considerable amount of time in as far as this matter is concerned to doing my best to persuade colleagues that the benefit payment card ought not to be part of it. I think you have to look at these things together because they go together. You know, that's life. That's the way you look at things.
And just to understand that finally, then, so if the thing had been going swimmingly, your first two reasons of principle wouldn't have risen to the surface. Is that right?
But if something might be going swimmingly in the sense that you know it was being delivered, it still wouldn't stop me thinking, but we shouldn't ever have been doing this in the first place because you know I wanted people to move to ACT. I wanted benefit recipients to be treated the same way as everybody else, and not to compel them to do something they didn't want to do. I could have held all those views in perpetuity, but if there was a contract and we had no reason to to rescind that contract, I'd have been stuck with it. As it happened, those were my views, and at the same time, the thing was clearly grinding to a halt. So when I was asked in the questions that were sent to me when I drew out my statement, I said that right at the start, I said, look, these are the 3 points that drove me to the conclusion that I did. I thought it was wrong in principle, and actually in practice it wasn't working. You know, I mean, I don't, you know, I think that's a perfectly logical way of looking at things.
Can we go over the page, please, to and look at paragraph 4?
Could you wind it? Oh, yes, right, fine.
Thank you. 3 options are set out, and I'm just looking at them at the moment because we need to know what they were to make sense of the next document we're going to look at.
Okay.
Ms. Graham records that the 3 options on the table from the working group are as follows. Option 1, continuing with the project, but extending the overall period of the project from the original end date of May 05 to at least September 07, thus securing DSS indirect subsidy of the post office network for a longer period, offering ICL a better prospect of payback for its investment despite its failure to deliver. Option 2, proceeding with the project in name, but withdrawing from the benefit payment card elements of it, POCL to offer ICL the task of bolting on a banking facility to the Horizon automation platform, DSS to plan its migration to ACT to take account of Post Office's developing capability. Option 3, cancellation of the whole project on grounds of ICL's failure to deliver, otherwise essentially as option 2, but leaving POCL to run free to run a proper competition and to utilise other companies rather than ICL. This will probably mean around 12 to 18 months to procure a new partner for POCL to establish a banking facility in post offices. Can we then go forwards, please, and look at WITN 0420-0106. Thank you. Remembering that that note from Miss Graham was the previous day, the 17th of August, 1998. We have a note of a meeting with you, rather unusually a note of who said what, rather than a summary of events. I don't think it purports to be verbatim.
No, it looks like a note that somebody took during the course of the meeting,
Yes.
and it would ultimately end up as a, a summary. And it was very rare. I mean, that isn't verbatim anyway.
No.
It looks like somebody's notes.
The Secretary of State, that's you, said that neither the DSS nor the Treasury were particularly enthusiastic for carrying on as option one. And then if we go over the page, please, and look at the foot of the page, you're recorded as saying we have grounds to terminate the contract and want to terminate the contract. We do not want the card anyway. And then at the top of the next page, please, SG, which I think is Miss Graham, but we need to avoid an allegation of termination for convenience. There are also opportunity costs now because of ICL's delay. And then three answers or three sections on Secretary of State, we would have to say that we were terminating for ICL's failure. We need a strategy worked out for ACT and the Post Office by the time of the decision to terminate. Those sentences together culminating in we would have to say that we were terminating for ICL's failure. Does that reflect the fact that you wouldn't be terminating for ICL's failure, but you would be saying that you were terminating for ICL's failure?
No, and remember, these are not, this is somebody's note of a discussion. Look, let me just be clear about it. If the contract was working, we could not terminate it. That's the end of it. But it was not working. There were serious delays in it. There were problems with the actual, what it was going to be able to do, and so on. But I was very clear, for the reasons I've set out both in my statement and during the course of my evidence today, that I did not think that we ought to be part of this because it was the wrong solution. Here we were with the fact that, remember, that the ICAL had already been served with the necessary notice together that we were suspending or going to terminate the contract. I therefore thought it was prudent that we should look at what else we should be doing, like ACT, for example. But, without wishing to labour the point, it was quite clear to me that this contract was not working perfectly. It was not delivering. It was being delayed. And there was some doubt, and you'll see that from a lot of the material that you've managed to recover. There was a lot of doubt about whether it ever would be recovered. And, what I'd also say is that as time went on, more and more my colleagues came to the same conclusion as I did.
And in the middle of the page, you record that, if we just scroll down slightly, the reality is we can't act unilaterally. I'm in no doubt that I want to get out of this contract.
Yes, and I've made that clear that I did, because in the light of the fact, in the light of the fact this contract was in difficulties, I think it was perfectly open to me to say, what do we want to get out of it? And I was pretty clear, as increasingly others became clear, the benefit payment card was a mistake. It was getting complicated, this contract. It was the wrong thing to do. When I say we can't act unilaterally, no, because, I was the Secretary of State of one department. There were others, clearly my colleagues in the DTI and indeed elsewhere, had a different view. But what I'm saying to you is, I was faced with a situation where it looked to me that the contract was in breach. Therefore, we could perfectly legitimately reopen the whole thing, and come to a different conclusion than the one reached by the previous government.
Thank you. Can we move on? I think it's fair to say that can come down. Thank you. I think it's fair to say that you were receiving communications to precisely the opposite effect from the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters. Do you recall that?
Yes, well, I can perfectly well understand why the Federation came to the view that it did. It saw the whole project as being a way of guaranteeing footfall into the members' post offices. And that's a perfectly, understandable position for, a federation or trade union to take. However, my job as Secretary of State for Social Security, as it then was, and as a member of the government, was to decide what was best for the government. And that is, you can criticise my judgment, if you will, but my judgment is that we should not have been in it. And I think, looking back, it was absolutely right.
And when you say your job was to decide what was best for the government, you mean what was best for the public as a whole?
Well, yes, the government acting on behalf of the public as a whole, but and nor does that in any way undermine the fact I also thought we needed to do something to maintain a post office network. Because of the social use of that. Incidentally, the benefit payment card would not have done that because you couldn't actually control which offices were going into, and the offices that were most vulnerable tend to be the ones with a lower population around it rather than ones in the middle of a city, for example.
Can we just look quickly then at what the Federation were saying to you at this time, and look first, please, at NFSP 50425. Thank you. You'll see that this is a letter from the General Secretary of the NFSP, Colin Baker, to you directly, dated the 4th of August, 1998. And if we scroll down, please, you'll see there are some pleasantries in the first two paragraphs. In the third, he says, clearly post offices feature highly as being central to the way people receive their pension or allowance. We're looking forward to the day when the delivery of these services is automated using the Horizon platform. The platform will be crucial in the development of other products and services resulting from welfare reform and social banking. And then in the next paragraph, because of recent press rumours that the Horizon programme is about to be aborted, we were extremely pleased to have had the rousing endorsement of Frank Field MP. Just stopping there, can you recall at this date, 4th of August 1998, what role or position, if any, Frank Field MP held?
I think he'd returned to the backbenches.
I think that's right. I think he'd ceased to be the Minister for Welfare Reform with effect from the 28th of July on that reshuffle.
Yes, on that reshuffle, both the Secretary of State and Frank Field both left the government.
Yes.
So I'm not aware of anything else he might have been doing, but I think in August, which is a month later, he would have been on the backbenches.
Anyway, continuing, the rousing endorsement of Frank Field MP to the automation platform and confirmation that the payment card will only be usable at post offices. I cannot stress how important these reassurances are. And I've been coming under considerable pressure as General Secretary to, quote, raise the profile, end quote, of what is at risk for sub-postmasters. As I'm sure you are aware, if the Horizon project or the payment card were to be cancelled, the effect would be dire on sub-postmasters and their £1 billion investment in the network. They would reasonably conclude that despite all promises of the past, the government had given up on them. They would see their livelihoods as being on the line and cannot be expected to take this laying down. So reassuring statements such as those of Frank Field MP are very helpful at the moment, although given sub-postmasters' current mood, and until they see Horizon rolling out in their post offices, we should not be surprised at occasional outpourings of concern. And that's the end of the letter, essentially. The NFSP seemed to be suggesting that they wanted the system rolled out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, yes, I think that was their position. And, as I say, for, trade union people representing postmasters, I can understand why they took that position. I'm not sure, and this was, in the press reports that were there, I'm not sure they went up into that much detail as to what exactly was going wrong. But it's not uncommon for the government to receive representations on things like this, but that should not stand in the way of the government reaching a decision as to what it thought was in the public interest to do. And as I say, well, we've explored in some detail what my position was in that. But that Colin Baker was always very reasonable, when he put his point of view, and on the occasions that I met him, and his successors for that matter. That was a view that the Federation held, and they're entitled to hold it. I just, I didn't share that view from inside government.
And when you met Colin Baker and in any other correspondence that you had with him, were any concerns expressed on behalf of his membership as to the reliability, integrity, or operability of the Horizon system, to the best of your recollection?
Not to my recollection, but then, the project, at this stage, we're talking about 1998, 99, the Horizon platform wasn't actually installed. It was still being developed. Remember, it hadn't been accepted by either us or the Post Office Counters Limited. So it wouldn't have been in the post offices. That came later, after the benefit payment card had come out of it. So, my conversation with Colin Baker at this time were, really in connection with the proposed Horizon programme rather than the actual.
And so if there were concerns being raised by sub-postmasters involved in the testing process, in model office testing at this time, they weren't reflected to you through the Federation?
No, and I would have thought, given the letter you're showing me just now, if there were concerns, you'd expect to be another paragraph saying, having said that, you ought to be aware, and then whatever his concerns were. So I'm not aware of it, and I've not seen anything in the material that's been sent to me that would suggest that that matter had been raised with me.
Can we go on to another letter from Mr. Baker within this period, please? NFSP 50250. And look at the second page, please. Thank you. This is 5th of November from Mr. Baker to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if we just go to the next page, please. We'll see it and scroll down. I'm not going to look at this in detail. You'll see he encloses an extract from Computer Weekly of the 5th of November 1998. Yes. Then if we go back to the previous page, please. He says, I was shocked, if we just scroll down, thank you. I was shocked to read the report in Computer Weekly this morning, which purported to have senior government officials as its sources. The suggestion that the BPC is to be dropped would completely contradict assurances given by Kate Hoey on behalf of your department at the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters annual conference in May, and by the Right Honourable Peter Mandelson yesterday at the Trade and Industry Select Committee. It would also appear to undermine the proposals put forward by the Prime Minister at the Labour Party conference in September for a single account, pilots of which I understood were going to be developed jointly between yourselves and the Post Office. I'd like to make it quite clear that any proposal to automate the Post Office network, which does not involve the continuation of the BPC, would be wholly unacceptable to sub-postmasters who've invested their livelihoods on the basis of assurances given by your government. The continued payment of benefits via the Post Office network is crucial to the survival of thousands of sub-post offices. Removing this income would leave the network unstable and unable to survive in the long term. I look forward to a speedy response to clarify you will not let sub-postmasters down by reneging on previous promises. I also hope you'll do everything as possible to prevent your officials from helping further scurrilous articles to appear in the press, which can only serve to undermine sub-postmasters' confidence in the integrity of this government. So to the similar effect as the communication that we just looked at.
Yes, well, as I said to you, he was putting forward his view and his members' view that, they'd held out very high hopes of the benefit payment card. I'll just say this, suppose the thing had gone ahead, despite everything that was becoming clear over this period, and the benefit payment card hadn't worked. There was two risks. One is to the postmasters themselves, but also, again, I mentioned this in the statement, for people who are on benefit, if they don't get the payment when it's due and the exact amount that they are entitled to, this can have catastrophic effects on that individual. The sums may seem small to somebody outside, but it benefits by their very nature, a slight, drop in how much that people are entitled to or not getting the full amount when it's due can have really very adverse consequences on people who are in receipt of benefits and their families. So if let's assume for this purpose, if the benefit payment card had been introduced, knowing what we knew at the time all this was going on, it would be taking a massive risk. And it was the initial anticipation was there'd be about 15 million people who were using the benefit payment card. It can have huge consequences, adverse consequences, and I had to have regard to that. Equally, and I said to you earlier that in relation to the post office network, the government's policy was also to try and maintain that. But that does not mean you therefore continue with a project which you can see increasingly is in my view, was flawed and was never going to deliver, and therefore highly risky. And you've got to remember, as the government, yes, you have to consider the well-being of postmasters and the post office network. You've also got to consider a very large number of people who depend on benefits to make ends meet. It's more than one consideration you've got in front of you.
Just exploring that for a moment, what would you say to the suggestion that that answer sounds as if you were not prepared to tolerate risk to 15 million individuals in receipt of benefits payments, but were prepared to tolerate risk to sub-postmasters who had to administer the system?
What I'd say is there's two different risks here. Let's say 15 million people relying on benefits every week need to get the exact amount they're due and when they're expecting to get it. And I would not take the risk of putting in place a payment card, even if it had worked. And remember, it didn't look like it was ever going to work, knowing that there was every chance this would happen. What would you say to the 50 million people who suddenly found they weren't getting the right amount of money and when they were expecting it? Now, there is clearly a separate risk in relation to a post office network, which is a slightly different thing. I fully accept that somebody who'd bought a business, a post office business, needed to have some certainty. But there are other ways the government could find to support that network. And indeed, actually, when the benefit payment card came out of it, and the government pursued a different course of action, that's what it did. But if you just look at this, and I cannot preempt whatever the inquiry comes up with. Of what I know in this public knowledge with the problems with the Horizon programme, it rather suggests to me that when we make decisions, we need to be as sure as we possibly can be that if we're putting computer systems in place, that they actually work. And the way things were with the benefit payment card at this stage, I could not be certain of that.
Thank you. Can we take that down from the screen, please, and return to the narrative? If you remember, we've been looking at your meeting with Ms. Graham and others on the 18th of August 1998, and the discussion over giving as a reason or presenting as a reason for backing out of the contract, ICL being in breach of contract. Can we turn to paragraph 30 of your witness statement, please, which is on page 11. Thank you. 30 at the top. You say, by September 98, ICL had missed the 12th of August contractual deadline, and the view of ministers was that ICL was in breach of contract, a claim that was disputed by ICL. You give references to each of those things. On the 15th of September, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Stephen Byers, wrote to ICL excuse me, to inform them that ministers had decided to allow a period of 1 month for discussion between the parties to see whether satisfactory commercial terms could be agreed for continuing the project, and that a special advisor would be appointed to work with the parties towards finding a solution. That can come down, thank you. Now, you know, I think, that Graham Corbett was appointed as that special advisor or troubleshooter or honest broker.
Yes, I know he's appointed, yes.
Why was that period allowed, and why was he appointed if, in your view and the view of the DSS, was crystal clear, as we've seen, that the benefit payment card was not going to be a part of this programme going forwards?
Because that was my view, and obviously it follows it was the department's view. But you know, remember on the other side, if you like, the DTI and Post Office Counters Limited had a different view. They thought the thing was still salvageable. And equally, you know, as I said to you in my evidence this morning, the Treasury would want to be satisfied whatever you did represented, you know, good value for public money and spending, and also in relation to the costs. And you know, when I looked at all this material earlier in the summer, you know, I thought, well, you know, one criticism might be, why did you take so long to reach the decision? Because it, you know, it was almost a year before we finally reached the decision. Part of it was that there were competing views within government, and therefore, you know, due process, if you like, had to be followed before we reached the decision. And you know, the Corbett appointment was clearly another attempt to see what could be salvaged.
And indeed, that has been a criticism that has been made by others, with the suggestion that 1998 was, quote, a lost year in the programme. But your response to that is the one you've just given, namely, there were competing principles and objectives at play, different interests that required to be served, and it took time to work through those.
There was also a lot of change of personnel during the course of 1998.
The reasons for which I'm not going to explore with you.
You know, but there were, as a matter of fact.
Yes. Can we look, please, at Bayes 50284? Thank you. This is a letter from Mr. Byers to Mr. Todd, the CEO of ICL, dated the 15th of September, and effectively puts to him the suggestion of the Corbett negotiation. Can we see in the first paragraph, he says, as you know, ministers have been reviewing the future of this project in view of the serious delays to the implementation timetable and ICL's failure to deliver a key contractual milestone for which ICL has been placed in breach of contract. That's what you referred to earlier.
Yes.
In paragraph 2, second line, however, we've decided without prejudice to our legal rights to allow a period of 1 month for discussion between the parties. Over the page, please. To facilitate the process, I'm proposing to appoint an advisor to work with the parties towards finding a solution. The terms of reference are attached. And then this, to provide a satisfactory outcome, the conclusion of the discussions must meet a number of basic criteria. One, any adjustment to the contracts must, of course, be compatible with procurement law. And two, the contract must provide a firm date after which the benefits agency will have no further commitment to using the BPC. We anticipate that the benefits agency will wish to complete a transition to ATT-based payment methods by this date. You see there that this seems as if the proposal was being put to ICL Pathway on the basis that the benefit payment card would be a part of the project. Indeed, it was one of the basic criteria, as the letter describes it, but that in future there would be a date when you could transition out of its use and move to ACT. Isn't that a fundamentally different proposition to what had been agreed in your department?
Well, I'm reading it rather differently. It says that it doesn't say it was going to remember, a benefit payment card was a fundamental part of the contract that we're talking about. It was in there with the bricks, if you like. The way I read this is that you can already see that government thinking is shifting somewhat, and in that you're talking about the contract must provide an end date, if you like. Now, if you thought this was going to run in perpetuity, you wouldn't put in something like that. What it's doing is acknowledging the fact this has got a shorter shelf life than might have been thought. Because then it says we anticipate that the agency will wish to complete a transition to ACT by this date. In other words, it's signalling an end to it. And if you like, that really adds to my point. Why on earth would you produce a new card which when you knew that you weren't going to be using it for very long? And indeed, I think in the other correspondence that I've seen and other papers I've seen, the point is made on a number of occasions that in fact, John Denham raised it in his first letter or second letter, that this was using technology which was looking increasingly like it was going to be out of date at the beginning of the following century. So I read it differently to the way you're reading it.
I understand. You read this as meaning that the BPC will have no part of the system.
What it's saying is it's there, but it's coming to an end. Now, if I was ICL, that's the way I would read it, and that's what I'm assuming that Stephen Byers was hinting at here. But you remember I said there was divisions due to competing views within government. You remember we were also dealing with a firm whose its stated view was it was not in breach of contract. But that doesn't stop those of us in government from thinking, well, how could we do this better? So what I'm reading here, in the way that I read it, is you begin to see the government's thinking is starting to change, and of course you see a lot more of that by the time you go into 1999.
Can we move forward then? That can come down from the screen. I'm not going to take you through the protracted interdepartmental correspondence of December 1998, largely because it was superseded by events. But there are just two letters that I want to draw to your attention, if I may, and ask for your views on them. Firstly, a letter that you wrote to Stephen Byers on the 11th of December 1998, Bays 40417. So just to put this in context, because we have skipped forward a little bit, the context was that Adrian Montague had reported the Corbett negotiations had failed. The government had invited ICL to make new proposals. ICL had made new proposals in a letter of the 9th of December 1998, which had been sent to you by Keith Todd, the chief executive of ICL. And you are offering your views on the Keith Todd letter, not back to Mr. Todd, but to Mr. Byers in the Treasury. Yes?
Yes, yes.
And if we could just read it. Keith Todd has written to me with a copy of the letter he sent you on Wednesday. That was the letter of the 9th of December, setting out ICL's final offer in response to your letter of the 20th of November. I understand that this letter constitutes the essential components of the proposed offer on which ICL are not prepared to move further, and that this letter is underpinned by 3 supporting papers on acceptance testing, funding, and commercial proposals, i.e. pricing, etc., on which they say they are willing to negotiate the detail. Scroll down, please. In preparation for our meeting on Monday, you and colleagues may find it helpful to have my initial response to the proposals as I understand them. I'm going to skip over the first one, which is the Fujitsu support for £600 million. to fund the
Yes.
project. And then if we can go to the second one over the page, it doesn't make any significant change to their 9th of November proposals, which we rejected. And then the third one is the one I want to ask you about. On the specific conditions that the proposals seem to involve, I couldn't agree to the proposed approach to acceptance testing. ICL persist in asking for acceptance on the basis of a laboratory test of the systems as opposed to a live trial, particularly important when for our customers it's the service that is the crucial end product. In fact, the approach being suggested by ICL is almost exactly that followed under the NEARS 2 project, where the system was fully accepted in a test environment but didn't work in the field. I'm not prepared to sign up to another NEARS 2 experience. In any event, when we're talking about a system which is affecting around 15 million people, many of whom are dependent on timely and accurate payment of their benefits for their livelihoods, the political risks are huge if the system isn't tested properly beforehand to make sure it works. This is a risk I am not prepared to take. That was essentially the point you were making about 10 minutes ago.
Yes.
Your understanding was, therefore, that ICL were proposing to set out acceptance criteria that were related to a laboratory test of the system as opposed to a live trial. Is that right?
Yes, I think my recollection is they were proposing to test it in 300 post offices of a network which I think then was 18 or 19,000. I wasn't prepared to accept that, and advice of my officials. Obviously, I took that into consideration. Before without labouring the point, you're dealing with 15 million people here, and you need to be pretty sure the system is going to work. Because remember, if it doesn't work, it's no easy matter to suddenly start putting in place a manual payment system to help people who've basically run out of money. So no, I didn't regard the acceptance testing program they were suggesting, because I thought it was far too risky and a risk I wasn't prepared to take.
Just on a point of detail here, you appear to be suggesting in this letter that it was a laboratory test of the system, not a live trial involving 300 or any number of hundred post offices on the ground. Was that your understanding at the time?
Yes, it was it was a laboratory test, which, as we all know, is not the same thing as in the field.
In any event, Ian McCartney MP, the Minister of State,
Yes.
effectively for the Post Office, replied to what you said. Can we look at his reply, please? Bays 40400. Can we see it's a letter to you? Sorry, a letter to Mr. Byers.
Yes.
Commenting on your letter, essentially.
Yes.
We should just look at the top of the page to see that it's from Mr. McCartney. Yeah, there we are.
Yep, I see that.
And then scroll down. I'm grateful to Alistair Darling for copying to Peter Mandelson and myself his letter to you dated the 11th of December, in which he set out his initial reactions to ICL's proposals. He's writing to you in the following terms: as our initial reactions differ substantially on a number of points. And essentially, this letter, and it's 3 and a bit pages worth, goes through point by point, seeking to comment on or rebut some of the points that you make.
Yes.
And if we look at the third paragraph, taking Alistair's points in turn, and then he commences. Now, can we go over the page to the second page? And the middle paragraph, third, acceptance testing, which is the point I'm asking you about.
Yeah.
Third, acceptance testing. Alistair states that ICL persist in asking for acceptance on the basis of a laboratory test of the systems as opposed to a live trial. We agree with him that this is a hugely important point. It would be unthinkable to sign off acceptance of the system until it has been shown convincingly to work on a reasonable scale in a live environment. But Alistair is, we believe, mistaken. ICL are asking no such thing. The company have moved substantially from their 9th November position and have now conceded that acceptance will follow live trials based on the NR2 software release at 300 offices. More specifically, there are 200 separate components of the acceptance test procedure. Some do indeed involve elements of bench and or model office testing, but underlined, all also include live trial in 300 offices. Beyond that, there's contractual provision for any significant fault not defined in the acceptance process, but which manifests itself during live trial to be rectified before acceptance is signed off. Finally, the contracting parties can withhold the release authorization for national rollout if they remain dissatisfied at the performance of the system during the live trial phase. Peter and I are not clear what further reassurance Alistair requires. So this letter is saying that you were wrong to be making the point about ICL being prepared to accept laboratory testing. There was going to be a live trial in 300 post offices. What was your reaction to the news or the suggestion that it was all okay because there were going to be trials in 300 post offices?
Much the same as my reaction I just discussed a short while ago. 300 offices out of 19,000. It might expose difficulties, but then it might not. Look, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to the point. You are dealing here with, or would have been dealing here with a system that was paying out benefits to maybe 15 million people. And, you know, the risks if it goes wrong, and remember, with everything we knew about the difficulties that had been up until now, which are well documented and we've discussed extensively today, you are taking a huge risk. So no, it didn't reassure me. You know, I just thought, you know, let's leave aside the principal points that I made earlier, but in relation to the practicalities here, this didn't look like it was going to work, or it was going to take a lot longer if it ever was going to work. But there's a, you know, I've made the point. I don't want to repeat it again. You know, it might help you to know that separately, sometime after that, you know, I remember one weekend the Child Benefit Agency made a mistake, and its computer system made a mistake and actually overpaid people quite a lot of money, which we never got back, because it's very difficult to go back to people and say you were overpaid by, you know, in £5, £6, £10 and ask for it back when people are, you know, on low incomes. It's you know, the benefit system it works, but if it goes wrong, it can go wrong, horribly wrong. And this was a brand new system for all reasons I've stated. It's frankly, what was being offered here did not satisfy me.
Thank you. That can come down. The second set of correspondence from the December 98 period, I would just like to look at, please, is Bayes 40418. A letter from Peter Mandelson, Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, to Stephen Byers, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And if we just go to the second page, footer of the page. Just scroll down, please. We can see that you are one of the people copying.
Yes.
So back to the first page, please. I was excuse me, disappointed that in our meeting yesterday was again unable to reach a clear decision on the way forward. The continued uncertainty is becoming increasingly damaging for all parties concerned. As I see it, the choice is a straightforward one. I'm not going to look at the choices. If we go to the second page, please. Mr. Mandelson said there is still some way to go to complete the Horizon project, but the basic development work has been thoroughly evaluated by independent experts who have pronounced it viable, robust, and of a design which should accommodate future technological developments. To your knowledge, by December 1998, which independent experts had carried out an evaluation, a thorough evaluation, that came up with a pronouncement such as that?
Well, I was looking at this again. I don't know. Remember the Montague report had flagged up the difficulties inherent in a large, complicated project like this, as well as mentioning some of the other difficulties. And also, I mean, I'm not sure you're coming to this, but on Friday night of this last week, the inquiry sent me a paper which I'd not seen before, which listed endless problems with the thing, really quite serious ones. So I don't know, I'm not sure what Peter was referring to here. I really don't. Hello?
Did you agree at this stage with his apparent conviction that the continuing with the Horizon solution for a payment card plus front-end banking was the only sensible course?
No, I didn't agree with him, as is clear from all the correspondence that follows.
Did you ever think that the DTI had got too close to ICL, even being captured by them to push their own agenda?
No, I think the DTI, for reasons that I can understand, was concerned with the political problem it had in relation to trying to maintain a viable post office network. The post office network was and remains today, but I think to a slight lesser extent, a big political issue. People like they like their post offices, and I think the problem was, and certainly if you look at the internal stuff which the inquiry sent me, which I've obviously not seen before, but in their dealings with ministers, it was clear that the DTI were very wedded to this, and I can see why ministers wrote the letters they did. It just I just took a different view from this, and I'm sure we'll get to that point. But at the end of the day, my argument won the day.
Can we get to that point then and move to CBO 6058? We can see from the fax header, if we just go to the top, please, that this document appears to have been faxed on the 23rd of April 1998. You'll see that it's a note to the Prime Minister. And if we go to the third page, please. At the foot of the page, we can see that it's from Alan Milburn and also dated the 23rd of April 1998. 99, sorry. We can see, if we just scroll up to 7, that the minute was copied to, amongst others, you.
Yes.
And the minute has attached to it some lines to take if ICL withdrew from the project. Can we go to page 11 of the document, please? If we scroll down, please. Is that readable to you? This is a photograph of a document from within the National Archive.
Yeah, I can read it.
Thank you.
It's a bit twisted at the top, but I can read it.
Independent reviews of the Horizon project by external IT experts have all concluded most recently this week that ICL have failed and are failing to meet good industry practice in taking this project forward, both in their software development work and in their management of the process. Do you know what that's a reference to? So the week of the 23rd of April 1999, external IT experts concluding that ICL Pathway have failed and are failing to meet good industry practice?
Well, look, I'm sorry, I don't have all these papers immediately in front of me to be able to tell you what was concluded in the week before the 23rd of April. But it fits with my recollection that we had a growing body of evidence that it wasn't going to work. And it comes back to what you asked me just a few moments ago, whether I agreed or disagreed, about another independent expert. This recollection or this statement in Alan Milburn's memorandum accords with my recollection that the thing wasn't working, and we were rapidly reaching the end of the road.
He lists over a series of 8 or so bullet points.
Yes, and I see the model office testing, for example, was delayed by 2 months.
Yes, looking at them, all planned release dates have been missed. Model office testing was delayed by 2 months. Every release has been subject to reductions in planned functionality. Even when each release has gone live, there have been faults and problems, which have resulted in the need for pathway to reimburse DSS. In the current trials, known problems have risen from 46 in November 98 to 139 at the end of March 99, and currently 146 haven't been resolved. 16 million people should have by now been paid by the benefit payment card. In fact, only 30,000 plus people are currently being paid by that means. Rollout of the system to 19,000 post offices should have been completed by the end of 98, but only limited functionality is currently available in 204 post offices, and delays to the programme have already cost the government over £200 million in savings it would otherwise have expected to make. These were the lines to take in the event that ICL backed out of the contract, terminated the contract. That's a comprehensive list of failings there, isn't it?
It is, and you're asking me earlier about whether or not I was wise not to take the risk of rolling this out to 15 million people. It strikes me looking at this, well, there you have it. There was an awful lot wrong with this. I could not in all conscience have agreed to the rollout of something like this. It would have been a disaster.
Was there any discussion of, given the government was prepared to say this about ICL's comprehensive failures, if ICL withdrew from the contract, that ought to be taken into account in deciding whether to proceed with the contract at all?
I don't remember any discussion like this. Are you showing me, is this a line to take? This,
yes.
Yeah. It was very common in my experience in all government departments I was in for people to produce lines to take. I always treated them with, a slight degree of hesitation about what I would actually use. But I don't know where these lines to take came from. Certainly, if you were going to say this, I'd want to be satisfied that they've been legaled, as they say. That's not to say that what I'm seeing here is, it accords with my recollection. Whether or not you'd want to say that in public, I don't know. But it's to the best of my recollection, this was not discussed. Certainly, it wasn't discussed with me as a line to take.
Thank you. Can we go to paragraph 102 of your witness statement, please? Which is on page 35. You say in 102 at the top of the page there, in a letter from the Prime Minister's Principal Private Secretary dated the 11th of May 99, the Prime Minister indicated that any solution should meet 3 key objectives. A, conflict with the Post Office and the sub-postmasters lobby should be avoided. ICL's whole future should not be put at risk. And the government should have a fully defensible position before the Public Accounts Committee. Can we just briefly look at that, please? CBO 6022 at 2, please. This is the document I think you're referring to. And if we go to the second page, please, and see that it's signed off by the late Jeremy Hayward.
It's a readout from a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
Yes.
Yes.
And the Prime Minister said any solution should meet the 3 key political requirements, and they're there set out. We didn't want a huge political row with Post Office or the sub-postmasters lobby containing the entire rural network had been put in danger by the government. The 3 requirements set out there, reflected in your witness statement, do not say anything as to the reliability or integrity to of the system. Do you know why that wasn't included as a requirement?
No, I don't. I mean, I wasn't in this discussion, and I think the reference to these 3 points have been made earlier. I mean, obviously, I don't know who decided the terms of this readout or what was said. I just wasn't there. It doesn't alter anything that I've said to you so far, though.
Would you agree that the 3 key political requirements appear to be focused on how things might look from the outside?
Yeah, but that's what prime ministers do. They've got to look at what's happening generally. I regarded it just as it was a view in a meeting, but the end was different to that. Excuse me.
Yes, you want to take a moment to have a drink?
Sorry.
Were you involved after it had been decided that the benefits agencies at BPC should be pulled from the project in any decision making as to the reconfiguration of the contract?
No. That would have been done by, I assume, the DTI and and the ICL. Well, certainly, I say in my statement that there would have been tidy up things. For example, payments in respect of the order book control system, which are, I think, referred to in some of the papers that you've got. And also, I would have seen stuff about how you do migrate to ACT. But in terms of the renegotiation of the contract, remember, this was a different contract. It was one between Post Office Counters Limited and ICL. So the DWP would not, I think, have been involved in it. And certainly, I have asked during the course of the summer getting these papers, is there anything else? And I haven't seen anything else. And it's certainly my recollection that we were not involved in that. It was because we were out of it. We'd reached the situation where the benefit payment card was no longer part of this, and therefore our locus had disappeared.
Thank you. That document can come down. Finally, Lord Darling, you were Secretary of State for Trade and Industry for 14 months between May 2006 and June 2007.
Yes.
And as part of your role, I think you would have held overall responsibility for oversight of the Post Office.
Yes, that's right.
Was there a Minister of State with specific responsibility for the Post Office in that time?
There would probably have been, but I'm afraid I have not seen any of the papers that I saw, and I would not want to inadvertently name one of my former colleagues as being responsible if he or she wasn't. But the way things work in all government departments is the Secretary of State's in charge of everything. But there are 3 or 4 junior ministers who take, particular interest, and so there would have been. But I have not seen any papers at all in relation to my time. It is pure recollection that I have to go on when I'm talking to you today.
And I'm asking you these questions with that knowledge and on a relatively light touch basis. Was there a Post Office board, to your knowledge, at that time?
Yes, there was, because I used to have fairly regular meetings with the chairman of that board, and from time to time, I think the chief executive. And the main concern then was how did you maintain the post office network, and that was becoming highly contentious at that time because I remember doing a lot of media about it. But that, and sorry, also for the sake of completeness, at that time. They were also responsible for the Royal Mail. It was before it was privatised, and there was occasional discussions about that, usually labour relations rather than anything else.
Did government have a seat on the board at that time?
I don't think it did. That's not to say it wasn't nominating people to the board, but again, I would need to see the papers that I saw, and better still, the actual papers I saw before I can really answer your questions. I don't want to mislead this inquiry, but I do remember meeting the chair of the board on a regular basis.
Can you remember who that was now?
It's Alan Leighton, I think.
And can you remember who the CEO was, the chief executive?
I'm afraid I don't.
Does Alan Cook ring a bell?
Yes, it does now you mentioned it.
And what's your recollection of the extent of your contact with both men?
Well, I used to meet them fairly regularly. That's my recollection. And it was mainly to do, as I say, with the maintenance of the post office network. And it's one of these, it's inevitable the way that, there's the way this agency works. Normally with an agency like the Environment Agency, it has a budget, it has staff, and it gets on with, pursuing whatever the government's policy is. Or you get an agency that does things like the Benefits Agency did, or Job Centre Plus. It's got a particular task, it does it. This agency, the Post Office, is slightly different in that a lot of its business depends on the government being willing to, for example, subsidise the post office network. What it does is heavily dependent on the decision, in other words, of third parties, not the actual board itself, because the board is autonomous only to the extent that, for example, it maintained a post office network. A commercially minded board might take a different view to that. So it was really, and I think the board to some extent felt it was a victim, that here they were having to put out with the government's policy, and the government's policy was clear, but it's actually difficult to implement, which is why at the time we were looking at what can you do to put into post offices things other than postal services to make them attractive. And the ones that actually survive to this day are the ones who tend to have other businesses in there, which is getting them footfall rather than the pure and simple post office function.
Lord Darling, thank you very much.
I just really want to emphasise this point. If the inquiry is interested in all this, I need to see these papers.
Yes, we're interested, but not in particular in the period in which you held the office. It was more to take some general evidence from you,
sure,
as to the way in which oversight and supervision occurred at that time.
Yeah. Well, as I say to you, the Secretary of State of the Trade and Industry clearly has oversight. And remember that, as with a lot of things, the dispatch box risk, if you like, the political responsibility will always be with the Secretary of State, no matter what the Post Office Board happen to be doing.
Thank you. They are all of the questions that I ask you at the moment. Other call participants have indicated an intention that they wish to ask some questions. I don't know whether that is going to be realised or not, but can I start with Mr. Jacobs, whether he has any questions to ask?
There's one point that's just arisen. Lord Darling, can you see and hear me?
I can see you now.
Thank you. You've said in your evidence that you had a growing body of evidence that showed that the system wasn't going to work. And you've said there was an awful lot wrong with the system, and you couldn't in all conscience have allowed it to roll out. And then when you were the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry from 2006 to 2007, you had overall responsibility for the Post Office. Were you aware during any of this time that 736 sub-postmasters were being prosecuted as a result of the system from 2000 to 2015?
No, I have no recollection of that. But as I said to Mr. Beer earlier, if you want to pursue that, I need to see all the papers to be absolutely sure of it. But I think if you mentioned 750 postmasters, I think I would have recalled that had it been put in front of me.
Do you remember Lord Arbuthnot, James Arbuthnot, then raising the matter in Parliament, which led to the appointment of Second Sight in 2012 to investigate on behalf of the MPs?
No, I don't.
Okay, I just need to ask if I have any more questions to ask you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In fact, I think that's all of the questions that any call participant has indicated a wish to ask. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today, Lord Darling.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Lord Darling, can I just follow up what Mr. Beer was asking you about right at the end. And I'm conscious that you haven't seen the papers, so I'm looking for general evidence as opposed to specific evidence, if that's a distinction that's proper to draw. And it's the relationship between the minister and the board. And the impression you've just given me is that ultimately it was the minister who called the shots on what I might call any important issue relating to the direction that the post office should take. Is that too general?
It is a bit general.
Right.
Ultimately, where the Secretary of State is, therefore the government, is ultimately responsible for whatever a board is doing. But in fact, in a routine day-to-day basis, the Post Office Board would take decisions as to how they thought, for example, in this case, how the business ought to develop and so on. And as for the day-to-day running, only the board could know about that. There's no way, unless someone brought a particular issue to a minister, would the government, as such, know that there was a particular issue that needed to be looked at. In this case, the post office case, clearly the government set up the board to run the post office. It clearly had an influence in what the network might look like, because it could decide to intervene or not intervene to make the network larger or smaller and so on. But on day-to-day running, as you know, the day-to-day running of the Job Centre Plus, that does not come to ministers on a day-to-day basis.
No, I think I followed that really, and it was. I'm just trying to understand the difference between day-to-day operational running, which I fully accept would be a matter which the board would undertake normally, and where the government would step in. Where's the line, so to speak, if there is a line?
I think the line is where if something was going wrong, or you were aware that there's something that questions ought to be asked, then you would go, the government would intervene. Then it's difficult for me to lay down lines that would cover every eventuality, what might possibly happen, because there are none. It used to be said that the government needs to know if it's novel or contentious. But that in itself is a bit general. I'm trying to be helpful here.
No, I follow. It's just that
let me put it this way, if I may. If the board knew something was happening and that it thought that ministers ought to know about it, then that would be a good reason for the government to intervene, or at the very least ask questions. But on a day-to-day basis, the running of the network and how it operated, the government would not, or no one in the government would necessarily be told about that, because why else would you set up a board to run the post office network?
So is this a fair summary in terms of dictating policy issues as to how the post office should evolve? The government would take the lead. In terms of matters which might arise from day to day, then they would only reach the government if the board thought them appropriate for the government.
Yes, I'm not aware of any mechanism where the government would routinely ask every month, is there something that's happened that we ought to know about? The other way the government, of course, does become involved is if members of Parliament raise issues in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
In which case, it's entirely proper for the minister to ask the department to find out what's behind the question, if you like. But one of the things that the day-to-day running of the post offices and how it was operating, and decisions like, this is a live issue for the inquiry, prosecutions and stuff would be taken by the board. I don't think they would ever come to ministers.
Okay. And just so that I can complete my picture, there's the post office board and there's ministers, but there are civil servants with particular knowledge and or expertise, shall we say.
Yes.
in how the post office operates, and what would their role be in this rather? I won't use it. What would their role be?
Well, it's largely undefined. But certainly as a minister, you would expect your civil servants to be, keeping in touch, maybe not in the detail, but just about what the issues are. But I suspect the issues that they'll be keeping in touch with, I mentioned, the post office, for example, is if it's obvious the network is starting to shrink in an uncontrolled sort of way, you'd expect your civil servants to be familiar with what's being thought and so on. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, or hasn't been a mechanism whereby a civil servant would have, if you like, a supervisory board function, and they would be every day actually proactively going around saying what's happening here, is there something we need to know about. It's not laid down anywhere. It really depends on the individuals, I think. But the decision as to whether or not to elevate something, if something has gone wrong, I would think you'd expect the board and/or its chair or its chief executive to say to ministers, you better have a look at this. But there is no automatic mechanism that I'm aware of that would guarantee that something was happening. It would go straight to ministers. I hope that's as helpful as I can be, I think.
All right, and so that we're both clear, you were speaking of your experience in 2006/2007, and that's the extent of your knowledge as it relates to the post office.
It based on my recollection.
Yeah, sure.
I've seen the papers, but my dealings with the post office, at that time were really all about how big should the network be, because we were looking at ways to try and, frankly, make it a little bit more sustainable. But that's an argument that's still going on today.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lord Darling, for taking the time and trouble to make a very detailed witness statement, and also to sit here for some hours answering very many questions. I'm obliged to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate it.
So can we break now for 10 minutes before
Certainly.
our next witness, Mr. Kearns? That would make it 5 to 3.
Yep, fine, thanks.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
The next witness is Mr. Kearns.
Yeah.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. If you take a seat.
Mr. Kearns, can I thank you for agreeing to change the day on which you are giving evidence? That's very helpful to the inquiry.
Please could you state your full name?
Anthony Paul Kearns.
Mr. Kearns, as you know, my name is Sam Stevens and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. And again, thank you very much for giving your evidence both in writing and orally today. In front of you, you should have a witness statement dated the 12th of October of this year, running to 8 pages. Could I ask you please to turn to page 7 of that statement? Is that your signature?
It is.
And are the contents of your statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
That statement now stands as evidence in the inquiry. I'll be asking you some questions today about both your and the CWU's involvement in the issues that this inquiry is looking at in phase 2. I won't be covering issues that it will look at later on in phases 4 and 5. I want to start with some background. And in your statement, you say that you were employed as an assistant secretary of the CWU between the late 97 and early 2002. That's right?
That's correct.
Before you worked for the CWU, had you worked for the post office?
I had.
And what roles had you had?
I was post office counter clerk.
And what roles did you work in for the CWU itself prior to becoming an assistant secretary?
I was an elected member of the National Executive Council, still employed by the post office but released from duty to undertake union activity.
And immediately before becoming assistant secretary, what was your role?
I was a member of the National Executive Council. I was substituting for the then Assistant Secretary, who was substituting up because the then General Secretary, Alan Johnson, in May of that year, left the union as General Secretary to become MP.
And you say you stopped being an Assistant Secretary in early 2002. Since then, what role have you had with the CWU?
Since then, I've been the Senior Deputy General Secretary.
Thank you. Excuse me. I want to ask you some questions about the CWU itself. And between 1995 and 2002, who within the Post Office did the CWU represent?
Post Office counter clerks at Crown offices, people who worked in cash centres, who handled the cash that was then subsequently distributed to Crown officers and sub-officers, and administration staff who worked back office admin work.
So when you say Crown officers, do you mean branches of the Post Office run centrally by the Post Office itself?
Crown Post Officers, yes.
And did the CWU represent any sub-postmasters during this period?
No.
Did the CWU represent any Post Office employees who were involved in carrying out audits of sub-postmasters?
From memory, I want to say yes, because the part of the Post Office staffing complement were people whose duty it was to audit sub-officers. From memory, I think a number of people on there might have been in those grades that we represented.
And did the CWU represent any Post Office employees that were involved in the prosecutorial function of the Post Office?
Not as I recall, no.
Not as you recall, was it? Please, could we bring up a document, CWU 6089, and if we could turn to the second page.
Which
This is a letter of March 1997. It's from Mina Rigo at the Post Office.
do we know where this is in the bundle?
So you should be able to see it on the screen next.
Oh, sorry.
No problem at all. Can you
Yep.
just confirm, can you see that?
I can.
Good, very good. It's a letter from Mina Rigo to Ernie Dudley, who was the Assistant Secretary of the CWU at the time. Now, would you have seen this letter at the time?
More than likely, yes.
And in your witness statement, you say that prior to May 1999, when a Horizon Working Group was started, the CWU didn't have any direct involvement in the Horizon project itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's as I remember, yeah.
But what you did receive would have been letters such as this, updating the CWU on the progress of the project to date. Is that right?
Yes.
Did the CWU take any steps around this time to try to involve itself in the Horizon project other than simply by receiving updates from the Post Office?
What we would have done, because it was our normal way of working, would be to ask the Post Office how that project and other projects would impact upon our members. So we would ask, is it going to change the nature of work? With regards to the Horizon project, given that we're moving from manual, what we call using the date stamp, to electronic processing, where were the terminals going to fit, what training would be given, and we would take the opportunity to ask whether that was a reskilling opportunity to argue or ask for increased terms, better terms and conditions. So we would respond by asking how it would impact upon our members, and then work out, a strategy around that, how we would approach the Post Office.
Do you recall yourself being involved in any of those discussions?
At the time when Ernie Dudley was the Assistant Secretary, if he felt the need, he would take either myself or other executive members along to meetings if we thought we would add value. I don't recall being involved in meetings around 95, 96. And I was his substitute insofar as if he was on leave or off sick, I would take over his role. So I would have been shared, seen copies of those letters at the time.
Could we please bring that letter back up and go to the third page? Thank you. Just going to read for the record the first paragraph. It says, a trial of the order book control system will begin from the end of April 1997 in 200 post offices in the North East and South Wales and South West region. This will be followed by introduction of BPS to these offices in June, and then in September, AP and EPOS will be added. At this stage, a further 200 outlets will be added to the trial. It is only at then that branch officers will be added, as clearly it is only at this point that Echo can be replaced by Horizon. A decision to roll out will be made in November following a full and detailed evaluation. So this is referring to a slow rollout of a few branches to trial the system. Do you agree that a live trial was important to test how Horizon would affect the working lives of those working in the post offices themselves?
Yeah, I would agree that would be important.
And when it refers to branch officers, is that referring to the Crown Office branches?
Yes.
So for you, the Crown Office branches, that's where the majority of your counter staff, at least, your members who are counter staff will be working?
Yes.
And the reference to Echo, could you just expand on what that is?
That's the name that was given to the system, the account system that was in before Horizon.
And that was in Crown Office branches, was it?
Yes.
The letter goes on to state on the third paragraph, again, due to the fact that evaluation will not have been completed and a final decision on national rollout not made till November, only a limited number of branch officers will be included in this stream, principally to ensure completion of installation in discrete geographical areas. This is because, in the event of any teething problems with Horizon, we do not want to create disruption in our larger outlets, which already use an automated system, brackets Echo, that has to be removed at the time of installing the Horizon system. Now, that document can be taken down now, thank you. Do you recall when Horizon was actually rolled out, which is later, when the first Crown Office branch was migrated?
I'm afraid I don't.
Did you have any concerns about this plan, that there would not be a significant number of Crown Office branches within a live trial, and it would be mainly sub-postmasters?
No, that wouldn't. I mean, from memory, that wouldn't have been our concern. Our concern would have been that it had been trialled and that it worked, and that the rollout was manageable in terms of the staff who would be, if you like, impacted by the rollout. So it wouldn't have been whether we wanted it to be slower or quicker. It would have been that it could be managed properly, and you know, any changes within the offices were flagged up, because moving from one system to another, I mean, health and safety issues, we'd want to make sure before they moved on to a further rollout that any teething problems, if you like, that our members had experienced that would relate to us, we would have had time to, you know, pick them up, represent them to the employer, and get satisfactory answers.
If in this live trial the vast majority were going to be sub-postmasters, how would you have found out about those sub-postmasters, or how did the CWU go about finding out what the experience of those sub-postmasters were?
I think they were represented at the Horizon Working Group that the then newly elected Labour government had set up. That those issues were being represented, and we would have, I mean, how do you describe this? Not sort of formal communications with, so there was another trade union involved with the CMA, which is the Communication Managers Association. And when we were going to formal meetings, you know, you would have side conversations. So, you know, what have you picked up? There were also, we were in I want to call continual negotiation with the post office as just part of our day job. Terms and conditions, health and safety requirements, normal day-to-day operations. And in those conversations, you would just generally ask, what's happening to Horizon? Outside of the formal set-piece DTI negotiations or DTI setup of the Horizon Project Group, we're almost in daily contact on an industrial relations level with the post office. And depending on which manager you were talking to and whether you understood them to have any knowledge or involvement with the system, you would ask, how's it going, type of thing. So you would pick that up. In a formal sense, it was, the issues we'd picked up, and I think I mentioned this in the statement, from some of the queries raised at the Horizon Project Group, particularly by the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, about some of the issues that they'd identified. And again, as I say in my statement, our questions would be, are they being resolved before you roll this out? Are they getting resolved?
Well, we'll come to the Horizon Working Group in a moment. What I want to ask is, before you attended the working group formally, can you recall what level of knowledge you or the CWU had about any problems or issues in the Horizon software itself?
Going back 20 odd years, I don't, if I'm being honest. No.
Before we get to the working group, I want to just ask a couple of points about the CWU's interests. Before automation itself, if there were errors or discrepancies in accounts prepared by staff, presumably those discrepancies would be put down either to human error or possibly theft.
Well, what would happen is you'd have a very large double-sided sheet of paper, manual process. When you paid out child benefit, pensions, green jardos, you would pay that out and you'd make a note of those. You'd add all those up, and in one column you would have how much cash you'd paid out, and in another column you'd have cash you'd received for people buying stamps, postal orders as was in the day, card, vehicle license stuff, and you'd balance those two things. And there was I can't remember at that particular point in time, but there was a degree of tolerance that losses under a certain amount would be, for want of a better phrase, they'd be recorded, but they wouldn't be used against the individual for disciplinary purposes. But if those losses mounted up over a period of time, or those losses were huge, so if you had a big loss, if you lost a couple of £500, then there would be an investigation into where that money had gone. If your losses were regularly £3-4, they would, for want of a better phrase, be set aside or ignored. If you regularly posted losses of, or even gains of £10, £15, £20, they would be investigated, because in effect it was evidence that somewhere along the line the job wasn't being done properly.
But that's it, is it? It's either someone's not doing the job properly, or more sinisterly, possibly theft.
Yeah. I mean, my experience was, if losses were in round figures, £100, £500, £1,000, then given that cash bundles were given to counter clerks to use as part of their day job in £100 and £500, the loss of a round large amount, in the post office's eyes and their own investigation division, my take was that people, they viewed that as more likely to be theft and someone just not doing the job properly.
And the CWU, presumably before automation, would represent its members if they're accused of substandard performance or misconduct.
Yes.
And I think, as you just evidenced, in order to do that, the CWU would need to have a good understanding of the working practices of counter staff.
Yes.
And at that stage, were the CWU aware of the post office prosecuting members of staff for suspected theft before automation?
I was aware of it. I've dealt with, I've represented individuals who subsequently got prosecuted, yes. So, yes.
Now, the introduction of Horizon was, fair to say, it would significantly change the way the counter staff's working lives would operate.
Yes. And
if the Horizon system could not reliably produce accounting data and produce accounts that didn't reflect the actual stock and cash in the branch itself, that would give rise or could create a suspicion of theft or incompetence on the part of Post Office counter staff. Is that fair?
That's fair, yeah.
So for that reason, was it important to the CWU to understand and be satisfied that the Horizon IT system would operate reliably and satisfactorily?
To the extent that we would make representations to, you know, to seek assurances that the system they were introducing was capable of doing what they said it was going to do, yes.
I'd like now then to turn to the working group and this point on satisfactory working of the system. Could we please on the screen bring up your witness statement? It's WITN 06370100. And if you could turn to page 3, please. Thank you. You say in paragraph 9 that you attended the Horizon Project Working Group alongside the General Secretary, Derek Hodgson. So you were attending this together as a sort of joint project, is that right?
Yeah, the General Secretary would determine. So as the lead of the union, the General Secretary, particularly when dealing with matters of government or matters of state, would determine himself who he would take along to assist him. I went to some of these meetings with him.
And you say that the role was, A, listen to and understand what the intentions of government and POCL were with regard to the future of the Post Office network and the Horizon project. Mm-hmm. B, to determine what, if any, implications this would have on CWU members. And C, raise any points relevant to the same. Could we turn the page, please, and look at paragraph 11? There you say, from memory, I do not recall that the Horizon Working Group was tasked with examining nor reporting on the technical issues, brackets faults, with the development of the system, and as such I cannot recall if any specific questions on this issue were raised. Thank you. I think though you do say in your statement you can recall the NFSP raising some concerns at some point.
Yeah.
Okay, with that in mind, I want to look at some of those working group meetings now. And if we could start with the one on the 8th of June 1999, it's NFSP 6026. And if we could start at page 2, please. Thank you. As you see, it's a note of a meeting from the Horizon Working Group on the 8th of June. Mm-hmm. Derek Hodgson is in attendance, but you are not. Can I ask us to turn to page 6 of this now, please? These are the terms of reference of the Horizon Working Group, said to be agreed on the 8th of June 1999. Would you have seen these at the time?
Probably.
And the second bullet point states that one of the roles is to oversee, to contribute actively to, and to facilitate solutions where problems arise, the completion of the development phases of the Horizon project. And it then goes on to refer to rollout and migration to ACT. So is it fair to say these terms of reference actually envisage that members of the working group would take an active role in relation to the development of Horizon itself?
I wouldn't say so, no. I would say that they were there to understand what was happening with the development stage and have that fed back to government, so as the government, if need be, because there was friction, as I recall, between the benefits agency who wanted the introduction of new automation so as they could, for want of a better phrase, reduce benefit fraud, and the post office, who wanted to introduce the automation because it thought would give them a gateway to more government services and therefore grow the post office or at least sustain the post office to where it was. My understanding of that was that the discussions would go on between the parties, being the post office and the designers of the system, and any delays and the reasons for that would be reported back to that, and if you like, a plan would be drawn up about what progress could be made, what delays and how those issues are being resolved. From memory, I wasn't at that meeting, but from memory, the sort of technical issues of like what was going on with the system itself, I don't ever remember being presented with, if you like, technical detail about how the system worked or didn't work.
And that can be taken down now. Thank you. That document. Thank you. Senior members of the post office attended this working group, along with members of the NFSP and the DTI. Was it not a good opportunity to raise and investigate problems so that they could be reported back to your members? Problems with the Horizon IT system itself.
And I think, as I said earlier, what we would have done would have been to listen to any delays and any issues that were being raised by the parties, and seek assurances that they were going to be resolved. And the reason I say that is because there's actually nothing we could do as a CWU to, if you like, to fix those problems. It was from our position, it was almost the post office had come to us and said, we're introducing this new automated system. We were like, are you sure it works? I'm oversimplifying the conversation here, but we were like, are you sure it works? Yes. Okay, well, the NFSP, and we've heard that there are some problems. We're working with the partners to make sure that those problems are resolved, and we don't intend to roll out until those problems are resolved. It was my sort of general feeling for what was going on at the time.
Well, let's move forward in the chronology to the 22nd of June 1999 and the second Horizon Working Group meeting. Please could we bring up NFSP 50203? If you could turn to page 2, please. This is a note of the meeting made by the DTI for the working group on the 22nd of June, as I say, 1999, in which you were in attendance. Paragraph 2 states that Ms. Rigo then presented an update for the group on Puckle's negotiations with ICL.
Yeah.
The terms of the letter of agreement on 24th May meant that the contract was now largely a given, and there was now a process of codification rather than negotiation. Mr. Hodgson argued that, in fact, there had been a fundamental change to the situation, not least because this was now not a PFI project, so this should not be seen as just a matter of codification. Just stopping there, can you recall what point Mr. Hodgson was trying to make on behalf of the CWU at that stage?
Yeah, from memory. So when it was a PFI project, my understanding was the onus was on the developer. I mean, I might have got this wrong in the PFI, but the onus was on the developer, almost like to fund this, and then would, if you like, get the money back in future years. Because the project or the agreement between the post office and I think it's ICL Pathway we're talking about now, but I'll stand corrected if it wasn't them. But the original agreement then changed to a new agreement. They renegotiated the terms of the agreement, and because it was no longer PFI, then the funding arrangement for the new system fundamentally altered. And I think our concern was, from memory, that there was a lot more onus on the post office to push funds into the project, which, for our concern, would affect profitability, and profitability would affect our ability to negotiate for better terms and conditions and higher wages. So there was a real concern about the financial viability of the post office for us around that, and I think from memory, that's what Derek Hodgson was referring to.
So financial viability rather than the technical details of the project itself.
That's my understanding. Of
paragraph 4, I can summarise this, but essentially Ms. Rigo discusses 3 emerging issues. Firstly, concerning technical acceptance, contractual acceptance. Second, regarding the spare technical capacity that may have been available now that the benefits agency had pulled out. and third over the page concern the pace of rollout. And if we could turn the page, please, and to look at paragraph 6. Seemingly in response to that, Mr. McCartney, the Minister of State, is noted to have said that the rollout issue was crucial. He was emphatically not prepared to accept getting away from the commitment to 2001. Slippage would make the wider discussions on government usage of the network impossible. If there were problems with software, training, etc., then these should have been flagged up earlier and must now be resolved in a way that enabled the 2001 timetable to be recovered. I just want to pause there to now bring up another note of the same meeting, and it's NFSP 50471, please. And if we could turn to page 27. Thank you. This is taken from the NFSP's National Executive Council report, which was between the 21st and 23rd of June 1999. And at the bottom, you'll see under the line, there's a brief report filed by Mr. Pebbody on the Horizon Working Group meeting we've just been looking at. If we could ask to turn the page, please. The third paragraph down, it says the subject of system faults was raised and the NFSP were given assurances that there would be software improvements to cure the present difficulties. The Federation were asked for more precise numbers of sub-postmasters who are experiencing difficulties, as this information would assist them to provide us with the help we require. And then, skipping the paragraph, it said roll would proceed as planned, starting 23rd, 25th August, reaching 300 per week by January 2000. There were some very serious issues still to confront, including training and systems difficulties, which must be ironed out. But there is no question of postponement or delay, which could cost approximately 8 million per week. Thank you. Now, the DTI minute we looked at before this document didn't have sort of specific reference to the NFSP raising concerns. Can you recall at this meeting whether the NFSP raised concerns about the experience of their sub-postmasters in the live trial that had been carried out to date?
I'd be wrong to say I specifically remember it. I mean, 23 years ago. I'm not going to say I can remember that. Generally aware at the time of issues being raised about some, technical issues in the trial period.
Could you expand on what you mean by technical issues? What was your understanding of the technical issues that were being reported by the NFSP?
The system was difficult to understand and learn, and it didn't, for a better phrase from our language, balance, which is what myself as a counter clerk when I worked on the post office used to have to balance your till once a week on a Wednesday night, and it was that almost that was the measure of you as an employee about whether you were capable of doing the job. So my understanding of serious concerns at the time would be around like whether it actually worked. So for a better phrase, when you pressed the buttons, it did what it was supposed to do, and then when you balance at the end of the week, it did the job properly.
So, and from the CWU's point, how significant were those concerns, or how seriously did the CWU treat the concerns raised by the NFSP?
To the extent that we would understand them at the time, we would look to the post office to seek assurances that these issues were being resolved.
Thank you. That document can be taken down. Let's move to the 7th of July 1999. It was another Horizon Working Group meeting. You weren't in attendance at this one. But I want to start first with a report that the Post Office filed in anticipation of it. It's NFSP 50226. If we could turn to page 2 of that report, please. do you recall seeing this report?
I don't recall now.
Would it have been something you would have seen, do you think?
Probably.
If you can turn over the page to page 3, and for the record, under training and support, the paragraph there states that the current live trial is revealing a number of important lessons which are being addressed for national rollout. Improvements in training, procedures and software which will give greater confidence in the service provided and support the achievement of the national rollout plan are being introduced. These are geared to reducing/curing the earlier problems of Wednesday cash balances that have been highlighted in the trial officers. And then if you could turn the page, please, to page 4. And under acceptance tests, it says contractually ICL need to have fewer than 20 medium incidents and no high incidents in order for the system to pass acceptance and claim £68 million. At the moment, there are 15 medium category incidents and 2 highs. We anticipate 6 more mediums merging, but work is also going on to clear or reduce all incidents. Now, do you recall at the time when, so this is early July 1999, did you or the CWU have an understanding of what acceptance incidents were?
No, my understanding at the time was that it was a contractual arrangement between POCL and ICL Pathway. I think it's when I referred to earlier about the change in the nature of the contract between the parties. And instead of it being PFI, it was then money would be paid over the period of time for usage of the system. But my understanding of that was that the POCL was sort of introducing, well, I want to say something like penalty clauses, where they say, well, if it fails, like incidences, they wouldn't. So that's why they talk about claiming the 68 million. That was my recollection of it.
Is it fair to say this, that in early July 1999, the CWU were aware that there were significant problems with the Horizon IT system and the software that it was based on?
We were aware there were problems because we weren't involved in the trial. To what extent we would class them as significant at the time, I wouldn't be prepared to from memory to state that specifically, if I'm being honest.
Well, if this report was raising problems, what questions were the CWU asking the Post Office to satisfy itself or to understand how significant those problems actually were?
I mean, that is, if you like, it would have been our day job, would be to ask, what are we talking about here? How big are these problems? What are these problems? How are they being resolved? Who's resolving them? What assurances are we getting that by the time we get to roll out for our members, these problems will have been dealt with? Well,
let's look at the meeting that report was made for. It's NFSP 50200. If we could look to page 2, please. So 7th of July 1999, Derek Hodgson is in attendance, but you are not. Paragraph 2 of the minutes refers to Mr. Sweetman's report on the negotiations with ICL, further to Pockle's paper, which had been previously circulated to group members. Paragraph 4. It says, on acceptance testing, Mr. Miller said that work was going ahead with ICL to a pre-agreed programme. Mr. Pebbody asked what defined a high category incident. Mr. Miller said that this would be one which threatened progress with the project within the agreed timescale. He did not think there would be major problems. Mr. Hodgson emphasised the need for regular progress reports. Now, do you at all recall whether Mr. Hodgson reported back to you on the outcome of this meeting?
My feel for this is that when these minutes or these notes were produced, they would have been given to me. I don't specifically remember him coming back from a meeting and asking to speak to me and talk me through what went on. I don't recall that specifically, and the reason I say that is because the other name down against the CW, Matthew Payton, was a member of our research department, and I think in the bundle he has produced reports and that are contained within the bundle. So the way we operated was senior negotiator, in this case the General Secretary, would go to such a meeting with somebody from the research department who would take notes, who would come back, and we would write up our own note, and then wait for those notes, and then they would be given to me.
So at this point, the CWU were aware of problems. Mr. Hodgson is saying there's a need for regular progress reports. I think your evidence earlier was it would be your job to keep asking questions of the post office and essentially keep track of these problems. Yeah. Is that fair? That
would be our role, yeah.
Can we then look at the 27th of July 1999? It's NFSP 706. So we can see on the attendance list that both Derek Hodgson and yourself attended this meeting on the 27th of July 1999. At paragraph 2, it says that Mr. Sweetman reported that discussions with ICL had gone well since the last meeting and went on to discuss about signing the contract. Paragraph 4 refers to Mr. Hodgson noting that there had been a number of major events since the last working group meeting. Refers to a select committee hearing, House of Commons debates, and on the Post Office white paper, and suggested that the transcripts and Hansard extracts be examined for points that will be of interest to the group. The minutes don't appear to reflect any discussion on system faults or problems with training. Is that accurate? Was there no discussion on those points at this meeting?
I don't recall. I don't recall.
Do you think there should have been a discussion on this, on system faults and training issues?
I mean, I'm trying to guess back 23 years here. The agenda would have been agreed. My understanding is that these agendas were agreed in advance.
Can you help? What were the CWU doing at this point to keep track of those? So from in July specifically, 1999, to keep track of the problems that had been raised by Post Office and whether they were being satisfactorily resolved.
I mean, as I said earlier, it's difficult for memory to say exactly what was going on 23 years ago, but we would have, outside of those big meetings with the DTI, we'd have regular meetings. And when I say regular, like every day, every other day, with various post office departments around issues that would affect our members. And sometimes Derek Hodgson would attend, sometimes I would attend, sometimes we'd devolve those to NEC members. And we would constantly be raising issues that we thought were going to affect our members. In terms of like specifics, did we ask at a particular meeting a particular question? I genuinely don't recall when that would have been raised.
I'd like to go to the next meeting in the chronology for the working group. It's quite a jump. It's the 11th of October 1999, and the reference is NFSP 6066. And if you could turn to page 4, please. So the attendance list has both you and Derek Hodgson in attendance for this 11th of October meeting. Paragraph 3 of the minute, Mr. Hodgson complained at how essentially delayed this meeting had been since the last one. Other than the evidence you've already given about general conversations, do you have any specific recollection between July and October 1999 of meetings you attended where issues relating to the Horizon software system were discussed with Post Office or anyone else?
I don't recall.
Can we turn to page 5, paragraph 5, please? Thank you. This says, Mr. Miller from the Post Office explained that formal acceptance of the reconfigured Horizon system planned for 18 August had been postponed because of Pockle's concerns about training, system stability, data integrity, bracket, there had been an unacceptably high level of screen freezes, and the effective operation of the help desk. The Post Office had accepted the system on 24 September on the basis that effective remedial action had either been completed or was in hand. Now, at this stage, do you have any recollection of what problems were facing the Horizon IT system? Does this note assist you at all?
The issue around the help desk stands out because part of the discussion we had was, well, if this system doesn't work, who'd you go to? And they were setting up a help desk, and our understanding of it was that access to that help desk wasn't as good as it was intended. And I think what springs to mind to me from this, from David Miller's comments, is the fact that, which I've said in my statements a number of times, that we were never being asked to sign this off. We were never being asked, do we agree that this system is fit for purpose? We were being told that through various methods, that there had been, if you like, issues flagged up of the type mentioned in this paragraph, but they were being resolved between the interested parties who were developing the system. And the assurance given to us is that by the time we got round to rollout, this would work.
You said that a few times, as you said, the assurance. How did the Post Office assure you that these matters were in hand?
Through statements like this, that they'd sat down with the parties concerned who were developing the IT, and that they'd resolve these issues, or they would be. I think, as David Miller says here, they would be resolved.
And was this a case of Mr. Miller would sit down and say these issues would be resolved? Do you recall if either yourself or Mr. Hodgson tested those statements by questioning them or otherwise? Not specifically, no. I don't remember ever asking that specific question. I want to look at two specific things that Mr. Miller says here. Sorry, can we just bring that document back up, please? Just over the page, I think. Yes, thank you very much. Paragraph 5 again. It says system stability. So two of the problems, system stability, data integrity, brackets, there had been an unacceptably high level of screen freezes. At this point, did you have any knowledge that the Post Office were not satisfied that Horizon could reliably generate or reliably balance the cash account?
I'd have to say specifically, no, I didn't know that was their specific concern.
When you see the words data integrity raised as one of the problems, what does that mean to you, or what would it have meant to you?
I mean, part of my role as head of finance at the CW and head of membership records is that the data on the system can be relied upon, i.e. that it is accurate, that it can produce for you what you want it to produce. And if there's no integrity around the data, then the end product is not likely to be what you want it to be. So to me, that would be a failing of the system.
Now, the Horizon Working Group continues, but I think a lot of the minutes go to issues such as the government gateway and how Horizon could be used. One of the things here you said is you sought assurances from the Post Office that these matters would be fixed. Following the 11th of October meeting, what did the CWU do to see that these issues were actually resolved, and starting with the help desk?
And I think I'm back to that point, if I can explain it this way, and again, I'm going back, I keep apologising for this, but I'm going back 23 years. If I go back to the substantive point I make, is we were never asked to approve this system. Yeah. So one of the phrase, we were told this system's coming in. Yeah. Well, we want to make sure that our members are trained properly. We want to ensure that it can be fitted onto the counters because it was new machinery. We want to understand how it's going to affect the day-to-day operation for our members on the counter. And then we would pick up through some of the questions raised, particularly by the NFSP, that there were problems at the development and trial stage. And again, I can only answer this the way I've answered it previously, would be, you see from Derek Hodgson, expressing concerns would be, are these issues going to be resolved before you roll this out to our members? And we were given the assurances that you sort of see in these minutes that they would be, but we were never, for one of the reasons, we were never asked to get under the bonnet and have a look at the mechanics to satisfy ourselves that it would work. This was, going back to the previous government, this was a decision made that this was going to happen. And the contractual arrangements between the parties where we were being told that as a working tool and as a kit that our members would work, that by the time it arrived, it would be fit for purpose.
But I suppose that's my question. Once it did arrive, what did the CWU do to, so for example, did you take feedback from your members as to how the Horizon system was working?
So if the Horizon system wasn't working, that would be, it just talks about the help desk, my understanding at the time. And this was sort of transition period now because the rollout sort of took place when I was leaving that role and somebody else was coming in, who I think is going to be a witness further down the line. And so the way of dealing with those issues would be a number. If there was a widespread system failure, we would get to know about it. If I specifically remember the stuff about the help desk, people saying they couldn't access the help desk, and that was no use to them. And then what it would show up, to go back to the previous comments I made about balancing on a Wednesday, talks about balancing on a Wednesday, would be people saying, I've been able to balance for years, excuse me, but now my till doesn't balance. And we would represent those as an individual. So we had a structure of, I want to call them field reps. So some officers had their own office rep who would deal with some of the stuff. Then there would be what most people call a regional rep. We call it assistant district organiser.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
And so the complaints, for want of a better phrase, would feed up through that system. So in the first instance, if there was an office rep, the office rep would try and deal with any problems that an individual member would come to them with. If they couldn't, or there was a few officers that had those problems, they would go to sort of the regional rep.
Sorry, can I just ask you, if you could just slow down slightly, sorry.
Sorry.
No, don't worry.
So if there were problems, they wouldn't automatically go back straight to the headquarters. There's a if you like, a system of a structure of reps, representative structures. Local rep, unit rep, sort of area rep, citywide rep, and then a north. So I was a office rep. Then I became the Liverpool rep. Then I became the Northwest rep. Then I got elected to the National Executive Council. And any problems that were, if you like, at the coalface, for want of a better phrase, there would be a recognised system of how they would be dealt with by formal agreement with the post office. So, if somebody was what we would call suffering losses and gains, i.e. a poor balancing record, then there was a system for that to be dealt with, which would start at the local level. So the point I'm making is not, if there were problems, they wouldn't automatically just come to us at headquarters. If there were widespread problems across the whole country and they were continued and not necessarily being resolved to the satisfaction of the local reps, then they would represent those problems to us.
And in the rollout period, so 2000-2001, do you recall having feedback given to you about your members not being able to balance and then taking that up with the post office as a system problem?
I don't recall me specifically raising a national problem with them, that there was a widespread system problem. I do recall, because part of my role was to travel around the country and speak to local branches, and me to say, apart from what you want on wages, reduced hours, how's the job going, type of stuff, when I'd meet local reps, is people saying, getting more complaints about people not balancing, but more often than not, they would try to deal with those at a local level. And because we had in place a system whereby I'm trying to remember specifically at the time, if you had so many, I think I tried to explain this earlier, if you had so many losses in a period of months, that could then lead to so you'd get a warning, yeah? So the boss would, the manager in the office would say, you know, you're not balancing, what's going on, any problems, so on and so forth. Try and resolve it at a sort of first base level. But there was written down procedures that would say if you suffered so many losses over a certain amount in a certain period, then that could potentially lead to so you'd be called to explain why you think that's happening. That could lead to disciplinary action. Because of that sort of structure of dealing with that on a local level, it's quite possible that those problems could perceive to be resolved at a local level through negotiations or representing people in if you like, fact-finding interviews or disciplinary hearings. So not all of those issues would, if you like, for want of a phrase, be dumped onto CW headquarters.
The things you learnt during attending the working group, including, for example, at the October meeting when there was an issue raised with data integrity. You were at that meeting and Derek Hodgson was at that meeting from the CWU. Did you pass that information on to others within the union?
So what we used to do at the time, we would hold regular meetings of the executive. I think there's some examples of letters we've received in the bundle where we put a document to our executive to explain updates, if you like. What we used to do as a union at the time was each department, and I was the head of that department that dealt with those issues, we produced an annual report which would explain to our branches and our members this is the work we've carried out in the last year, which would reproduce letters received from employers, would reproduce, if you like, significant issues that had arisen during the year that we dealt with. So that would be. We also had another system which is called letter to branches, which is we'd regularly, if we got significant updates from the employer on major issues, would issue letters to branches to explain to them what we've been doing. And so if there were any significant issues, that was the vehicle for sending them out to our local reps, for want of a better phrase.
So when the inquiry is then looking at how information was passed down through the CWU, we should look at the annual reports. I think it was the first one, and the second was the letter to branches.
Yeah, we'd have to go through our archive.
And I think you said in your evidence earlier that when you attended local offices, there were people reporting problems with balancing. In your mind, because you knew in October and before 1999 about problems with the system, and you'd sought assurances that they would be resolved, and you move to when it's being rolled out, you have numerous reports of people struggling to balance. Did you not think at that stage that the system problems may not have been resolved?
The problem with me saying yes to that is my experience of going around to local branches and what I'm getting told is anecdotal. This is not, you know, how you would go to a branch meeting, talk to the staff reps. You know, I'd give a report on pay negotiations or terms and conditions negotiations, or the big issue that was going on at the time with the post office, which this was designed to resolve, was from our point of view, the number of Crown officers that the post office embarked upon a programme of franchising Crown officers out, so selling them off from our perspective, because the post office believed that was a cheaper, more efficient way of doing it, to which we objected. And they were the big issues of closing offices down, a programme of wanting to close offices down. The idea of the Horizon project was new technology would give the post office access to more government services and therefore prolong the life of the post office itself. So I would go to local meetings and if you like, give that information to people and then go, right, well, what are your problems? The problem with people saying to me, oh, this, you know, having problems with Horizon, the system doesn't balance. What about that is, people not balancing, like, didn't just begin on the day Horizon came in. There's always been occasions when people didn't balance. So it wouldn't necessarily be identifiable to us or to me as an individual that the problems people were experiencing were directly because of the Horizon system, other than people saying to me, oh, I've always balanced and now I'm not. And you know, there's something wrong with this system. So which, when we would have meetings with the post office, we would talk to them about like what had they done, the assurance we'd sought when we were at the DTI, asking them, you know, are these problems being resolved? That would be our approach.
So in 2001, what was your view of the Horizon IT system? Did you think it was fit for purpose?
I mean, looking back on it, there were definitely more reports to me of people not balancing. There were definitely reports of the Horizon helpline not working properly, and people being able to, you know, to access that for assistance. So you could call it teething problems, or you could call it the system failing. But we would represent that to the post office and say, you know, we got more people who appear to be having problems operating the system.
The inquiry said evidence that the post office investigated employees for theft based on Horizon in 2000, which subsequently led to successful prosecutions. Was the CWU aware of those prosecutions in 2000?
I don't recall, as the lead CW rep on this, I don't recall any of our members being subject to that process. I don't recall.
And sorry, just going back in the time a little bit, one further point on the Horizon Working Group. It's been suggested to other witnesses that at the time the Horizon Working Group was in place, so it's the summer of 1999 onwards, that the post office was simply committed to automation and Horizon at any cost, really, and not considering whether it was fit for purpose. What would you say to that?
Generally, that, yeah, I'd probably agree with that. So it was sold on the basis of the benefits agency wanted it. So the previous government, I don't get political here, but the previous government set its stall out on reducing benefit fraud. Yeah? And the benefits agency wanted to work with the post office to eliminate benefit fraud on the one hand. On the other hand, there was a real concern about the future of the post office network because what the benefits agency was doing was new benefit claimants, pensioners, child benefit, anybody, were going to use ACT, automatic credit transfer. So instead of having the option to, in those days, have a book, which literally was a book with leaves you ripped out and handed over and got cash for, inefficient, benefits agency claimed, costly, open to fraud. So they said, no, we need a new automated system. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay everyone benefits, whatever they were, straight into a bank account, automatic credit transfer. And then, of course, for us and the post office, that was like business not going into the post offices, but going to banks. So what the post office wanted to do was to try and work with the benefits agency to find a system where people could still use the post office, but that risk of benefit fraud would be reduced, and then to try and work with other government departments for any government work, that if you had a proper integrated IT or automated system, that the post office would be the go-to for any government services that the public could access. And that was the whole idea of the concept of it under the previous administration. When the new administration came in, and I think we've seen that in minutes, you know, my recollection was there was certainly a tolerance of delays to introducing the system. But then there become a point where this has to happen. We need to get on with this. I mean, partly because the benefits agency, from my recollection, was, I'll use my language, getting fed up with the delays, because they were sort of like, well, we need this because we need to cut down on benefit fraud. And like, there's been delays to the contract, there's been delays to it being implemented, and therefore delays to us cutting down on benefit fraud. We wanted it. I'm not saying we didn't want it, but we wanted it because, you know, there was a real, one of us, very fight for the future of the post office. Because if, I mean, the government work, benefit agency work, from memory, I'm talking maybe 50% of the work that was undertaken. If you take out 50% of the work, you know, from a trade union's point of view, 50% of the jobs are gone, which is not something we wanted. So, to me, there was a rush to get it done. And once they identified this, my take on it, looking back, was there was a rush to get it in. I'm not saying people didn't try and resolve problems. There was a rush to get it in, and they'd decided that this was the system from whatever beauty parade that they'd undertook to identify the provider. And once they decided on this system, that was it. All roads led to Rome, and that was the road they were going down.
Thank you. Sir, I have no further questions. I see it's been an hour. We've only got, I think, we've only had one set of questions from the Howe & Co. Would you be content to take those now? We'll have a short break and then come back for those questions.
Sir, perhaps if it assists, I don't have any questions to ask of this witness.
On the other
think-
hand, something's come up during Mr. Kearns' evidence, which I would like to ask about, if I may.
Sir,
Right.
if we can take a
Mr.
break for 10 minutes, I would be grateful. We can discuss the question that may be put.
Well, let's ask Mr. Kearns. Mr. Kearns, would you prefer just to go through and finish, or do you want a break?
I'll just go through and finish. I'm fine.
Right. And if Ms. Page asks you a question that Mr. Stevens or I think shouldn't be asked, we'll intervene. But otherwise, you'll carry on, all right?
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Kearns, one of those that I represent was a Crown Office employee, and she was prosecuted. Her prosecution began in 2001. I was interested to hear that you talked about a loss and gains policy, presumably should have been in place at that time, and that should have been for all Crown Office employees, should it? Not just those who were members of your union.
That should have been for all. Yeah, I would describe it as part of your contract of employment. So you sign your contract of employment, saying these are your terms and conditions, hours per week, money you're getting paid, and so there used to be a bundle of documents, post office rules, and from memory, your contract of employment said these are your terms, i.e., where you're working, how long for, and what you're getting in terms of remuneration. But you are subject to post office rules, which are conduct, sick absence, if you worked on the counter, losses and gains. They wouldn't just be specific to CWU members. They would be for all staff working on the front.
Part of the terms.
Yeah.
Yep.
My recollection. Yeah.
And so anyone who experienced losses or gains should have really had their process. So Ms. Felsted should have had her process dealt with through that policy.
Yeah. That's my recollection. Yes.
Yeah. And what would that have entailed? Would that have entailed informal interview before anything formal and prosecutorial?
My recollection is that would depend on how you'd arrived at that point. So, this is the point I made earlier. If you'd had a series of, if every week you were misbalancing by £5, £6, £7, one way or the other, losses or gains, then to the employer, that sort of signifies. So most people go, it's only £5 or £6, £7. What does it matter? But to the employer, what that signifies is errors, i.e., you're making errors somewhere along. You're continually making errors along the line. If you're continually making errors in your job, you're not fit to do your job. So they would start a process. If there were large losses, and I don't know the case, don't need to know the case. If there were large losses, so I dealt with one where a guy, I was the rep, but he was working on a counter here, who lost £500, yeah, straight £500. The Post Office Investigation Division came straight in, because there would be, in their minds, and I'm not saying we agree with them or disagree with them, but in their minds, they would go, well, £500 sounds a bit more than someone just making an error. It sounds a bit like theft. And so they would come in. And the first stage interview there would probably be with the Post Office Investigation Branch, POIB, the IB as it was then, Investigation Branch, changed its name to something else now. So they would come in first off and go, we want to have an interview with you because we think you might have stolen £500. That would be the first place. If it was a series of small losses, there would be, from my recollection, fact-finding interviews, you would usually get a notice then to say if you have, and I'm from recollection, you would then be told if you have so many losses amounting to the value of X or other in a 3 or 6 month period, then we're going to take disciplinary action against you. So it would depend on the loss and over what period that the post office would call in their ID.
I see. Thank you.
And just so that I've got this straight, Mr. Kearns, was this policy back in, shall we say, 1996, 97, before the rollout of Horizon? Was that written down anywhere, or was it just understood, shall we say?
No, it would have been written down, because I can remember.
Right.
I can remember. I can remember representing individuals with that policy in my hand.
And there's no possibility the CWU still has it somewhere in its archives, is there?
Possibly.
Well, if you'd be good enough to have a look, I'd be very grateful.
I will do, sir.
Thank you. Anything else, anyone?
No, sir, that's everything for today.
Fine. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kearns, for giving a witness statement and coming to give evidence. I'm grateful to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. We return tomorrow with Colin Baker and Saria McCartney.
Fine. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.